Hi, I'm Mimi Geerges. The country of South Sudan is only 6 years old, but civil war rages, famine has been declared, and thousands of civilians are streaming into neighboring countries. Aren't these people sick and tired of war?
War is profitable
For the people not getting killed and starved to death.
The leaders of South Sudan ought to look themselves in the mirror and say, look what we have created.
Welcome to the Mimi Geerges Show. Everyone was really happy when the horrible violence in Sudan ended in 2005 and the new country of South Sudan was declared in 2011. The honeymoon, if there ever was one, is definitely over. In 2013, the president accused the vice president of plotting a coup, removed him from office, then the army starts taking sides, they split into factions, and before you know it, innocent people are being slaughtered, starved, or displaced. Here to discuss the conflict in South Sudan is Brian Adeba, Associate Director of Policy at the Enough Project, and John Tanza, a South Sudanese freelance journalist. Gentlemen, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Brian, typically when there's a political dispute in a country, it doesn't lead to this kind of a disaster. 1 in 3 people have fled their homes in South Sudan. How did it get this bad?
Well, the conflict dynamics are exacerbated with the continuation of conflict. A peace deal would have stalled the exacerbation of the dynamics that we mentioned, displacement, famine, but that did not happen. A peace deal that was signed in 2015 that brought both sides to the table to form a transitional government collapsed within 3 months. And right now the key question really is how to get the two sides talking again.
John, you've interviewed South Sudanese President Salva Kiir. What was your impression?
Just before I speak, I would like to make it public that my views are personal. It doesn't reflect the views of Voice of America, where I'm a freelance journalist there. Now, when I interviewed President Kiir in 2011, he sounded very optimistic about how he was going to run the country. Because I asked him, after the 21 years of fighting, what are your priorities? He told me he wants to silence the guns, he wants to see progress, he wants to see development for his people. Those were his words.
Yet 2 years later, everything's gone to hell.
Of course, everything went down because they did not follow their party rules. The ruling Sudan People's Liberation Movement was supposed to have convention every 3 or 4 years. They're supposed to meet together, talk about party issues, see how the party is functioning, is it serving its right purpose, and then if there are problems there, they address it within the convention. But that did not happen for quite a long time.
Because?
While Kiir being the chairman, he has not been calling the convention because the chairman is supposed to call the convention, meet with the secretariat of the party, decide for a day for a convention. But every time he's reminded about a convention, he doesn't give any reply.
That's because of his performance. Within the party itself, there arose a number of people who wanted to challenge him for the leadership of the party. And based on his record, which wasn't really showing great progress, and he knew that at some point within the party he had lost significant support among the members of the Politburo who were supposed to select a new leader. And he stalled on calling the convention because he didn't want to face that kind of contest.
So was the vice president actually plotting a coup?
Well, the question of a coup is really up in the air. There are no consistent reports to show exactly what happened really. But what we know is that there was a contest. And initially this contest was expressed peacefully. The vice president, Riek Machar, trying to use the institutions of the party actually to resolve that dispute. When that did not happen, elements supposedly allied to him mutinied in an army barracks, and very soon the president on the next day alleged that there was a coup. Riek Machar was on the run, and suddenly all hell broke loose, and we are where we are right now.
So the root conflict between these two men is really a political difference. One wanting to move in one direction, the other one resisting that move.
Yes, it is a political dispute that arose from the fact that the party itself had stymied all institutions of governance or its own institutions to the extent that they were not able to mitigate any differences that arose within the party. And the failure of the party to manage and mitigate this conflict is also reflective of the failure of all institutions of governance within the country that were really hijacked by the government and the elite in the SPLM and made to work for the SPLM elite.
And there's also corruption, so they're actually stealing money from the country's coffers.
Every year, South Sudan has ranked at the very lowest rungs of the list produced by Transparency International that evaluates corruption worldwide. Every development indicator in the country registers at abysmal levels. So there is really nothing really to write home about in terms of progress after independence in South Sudan.
So John, the South Sudanese army's purpose is to protect the people. How could they so easily turn against the people that they're supposed to be protecting and start killing them?
We have to understand this in the context of what happened in December 2013, when there was a fragmentation within the army, and when President Kiir came out in public and said there was a coup attempt, the army actually fragmented on tribal lines. The Machar's group went with him, and Kiir's group stayed in Juba. And so in the process of tracking the rebels or the coup plotters, the army went on targeting people based on their ethnicity. And you also need to understand that the army, the South Sudan army, is an amalgamation of a lot of proxy militia that have been fighting Khartoum for many, many, many years. For instance, there are commanders who have been shifting alliances. So it's an amalgamation of militia formed, not well trained. You won't call them a professional army who keep the international ethics of military people. And so in the backdrop of a conflict where you have an army that's not paid on time and whose morale are very low, they can do anything.
But a new army chief has just been sworn in. Is that going to change anything?
The latest information that he said the deployment of the UN Regional Protection Force that was proposed by the UN Security Council in September last year, and the government has been, saying one day they will say, yeah, the forces can come. The second day they can say, no, we don't want forces from outside the region. But today the new head of the army said he will work with the Regional Protection Force because it will complement the work of the South Sudan army. I think that's a positive step because the country is so vast and the military is overstretched. That's why you have proxy groups coming to help the military fight those they call rebels.
But we all remember the horrible genocide that happened in Darfur and other regions in Sudan. Aren't these people sick and tired of war?
Well, war is profitable. There is an incentive
for
here.
the people not getting killed and starved to death.
But the people who perpetuate the conflict, it's profitable to them. They benefit from it.
How?
They suspend institutions of governance, of accountability. They utilize that to contracts in the army. Someone is getting paid all this time that people are fighting, and that's the reason that the war is not stopping. And to get to the root cause of this war, we really need to also look at the incentive structure in existence in South Sudan. We have literally a kleptocracy where a group of a small elite has hijacked government, and government works at the behest of this elite. So the incentive structure here needs to be dismantled.
Can we do that? The United States? Can we maybe cut off the funding that's feeding this?
Absolutely. I mean, it has not been utilized, and the thinking has to change. Within the tools available to policymakers in the United States, there are those that exist that can be utilized to up the financial pressures on these people. For instance, most of their transactions happen in the US dollar. And for every transaction that happens in the US dollar, it's registered here in New York. So that money has to pass through New York at some point because of something called the correspondent banking
so we can just
system.
Stop that flow,
well,
can't
that
we?
money can be traced. Government can authorize the Treasury Department to take measures to trace that money. Where is it coming from? Who does it belong to? And then punitive actions can be taken to inhibit the movement of that money. And so when these people are hit in the pocket, then perhaps it will be a conduit to driving them to the negotiating table. In the absence of that, we will see conflict perpetuating, and we'll just keep talking and
keep counting bodies, essentially.
And endless peace talks.
John, what role of, if any, is Sudan playing? Are they benefiting from South Sudan being in a state of conflict?
Let me use the word when the divorce happened between Sudan and South Sudan. Of course, Sudan was not happy. They lost the oil revenue. They lost people. They lost friends. But then lots of events happened after that. Most of the people who were not happy with Kir, you could see them going to Khartoum and staying there and making fiery statements from there. And so when Sudan was put on the spot, that why are they hosting people who have rebelled against the government in South Sudan, Bashir said, the people of Sudan and South Sudan are one people. South Sudanese are free to stay in Sudan as long as they want. They did not chase South Sudanese from Khartoum. Anytime they come, they treat them as citizens. So it's difficult to see where Sudan is playing its roles. But there are indicators. There are indicators that you will conclude that Sudan has some significant role there. When the violence erupted in Juba in 2016, Machar fled the capital and walked for 47 days to Democratic Republic of Congo, and then he was airlifted to Khartoum, stayed in Khartoum. When I interviewed the Sudanese Information Minister, Ahmed Bilal, and he told me Machar is there on humanitarian grounds. Once his treatment is over, he will go back to his country of choice. So he stayed there and left. But again, recently, some senior generals who resigned from South Sudan Army have been making statements out of Khartoum. And so that speaks volume.
So the Sudanese involved in South Sudan to some extent on a tit-for-tat basis. We must remember that the SPLA itself had about 2 divisions operating in 2 regions that it was in, that is South Kordofan and the Blue Nile province. At independence, these regions became part of Sudan with the 2 SPLA divisions that are there, that are indigenous to those locations. So even though there is a political divorce, the 2 countries, to some extent, there has been support from over the border in South Sudan. And Khartoum has said, if you support my rebels, I will support your rebels. And that's where initially when the conflict started, Khartoum was to some extent involved in supporting Riek Machar.
And they have been trading those accusations. Of course, Juba will accuse Khartoum of supporting people who rebel from the south, and then Khartoum will also accuse Juba. Of recent, Sudan's information minister said Juba is trying to bring together the rebels of the SPLM North, because there was a split, there was a disagreement within the leadership of the SPLM North, and Khartoum accused Juba of bringing the top leadership in Juba and trying to reconcile them. So there's been that threading of accusations.
So let's talk a little bit more about concrete solutions. You talked about financially, that we can, trace the money and put pressure financially. What else? What else can the U.S. do?
Well, on the unilateral level, that's what the U.S. can do. On the multilateral level, there is need for measures like an arms embargo. The war can only perpetuate or continue because of access to weapons and ammunition, and when that happens, we have an endless cycle. So the U.S. can use its clout at the Security Council, for instance, and sponsor maybe a resolution that calls for an arms embargo on South Sudan. That being said, it's not an easy thing to do. Members of the council are deeply divided because of geopolitical interests in the region on this particular issue. So, but it's still worth a try.
Realistically, do you think South Sudan is on the radar of the Trump administration?
It's very difficult to tell, but when we look back at what Ambassador Nikki Haley said recently when she made a speech at the Security Council, where she called out Salva Kiir for continuing to perpetuate this conflict and all the other political elements in South Sudan. She called out the members of the Security Council for inaction and said, we need to rethink this policy of stalling or vetoing an arms embargo. So I think that's commendable, and that's the first time that a member of the Trump administration had actually said anything significant on Sudan. That being said, there are no indications that there is a major interest on Sudan, but if that speech was any indication, I hope it continues.
But you see, one thing the U.S. could use is diplomatic patronage in the region. Looking at the countries that neighboring South Sudan, Kenya, Uganda, Ethiopia, Sudan, these are very strong countries that South Sudan depend on them. For instance, South Sudan depend on Kenya for almost every import, you know, and even Sudan, they depend on these two countries. So if you work with these two countries to put strong punitive measures against the leaders of the country,
at the same time not hurting the people that are already suffering.
Of course, some of these punitive measures should be targeted at the leaders, not the people. Because if you cut aid, the people are going to continue dying. But if you touch the pockets of those who are perpetuating the violence, I think they will see sense out of it.
Brian, 83 humanitarian workers have been killed since December 2013. Female American aid workers were raped in July of 2016. Why is the Army targeting Americans?
It's just that I'm not sure whether that's specifically, targeting Americans is a policy, but when the aid workers were shot at, when the U.S. diplomats were shot at in Juba, tensions between South Sudan and the U.S. were high. South Sudan saw itself as really a product of the U.S. and at some point felt abandoned, and the U.S. was at that point pushing for an arms embargo at the Security Council. All those factors contributed to that kind of animosity, people calling out the U.S. in demonstrations, and then eventually it culminated in the attack on the U.S. diplomats in Juba.
But it was the U.S. that helped South Sudan get their independence. So how did they just turn on the U.S. so fast?
Well, very quickly, that was based on the stance that the U.S. took, basically on the values that the U.S. holds dear, democracy, the absence of that, absence of free speech in the country, proliferating dictatorship, and all those things have been called out by the Obama or by the some members of the Obama administration, and that didn't go quite well with the leadership over there, and that bred that animosity we're talking of right now.
And has anyone been brought to justice for any of these atrocities, or is there just total impunity?
They have its impunity. Any efforts of bringing anyone to justice are really cosmetic. To this date, I haven't seen any person brought before a court of law and prosecuted for that act. So this is a system, again, which is rampant with impunity. There are no checks and balances, and it's just that kind of system.
John, is the independence of South Sudan still, in hindsight, a good idea?
It is a good idea. I mean, when you look at it from the history of conflict that started in 1955, I mean, generations of people have grown up in South Sudan. All they know is fighting and fighting and fighting. And when the war ended in 2005 and in 2011, the country became independent, it was a sigh of relief. But the post-conflict scenario was not managed very well.
Maybe it was too early for independence. Maybe the country wasn't ready to be independent.
The country was ready to be independent, but the post-conflict scenario was not handled well. Let me give an example. When a dispute ends, there are certain issues that you need to really resolve them. Put institutions that will check the leaders. You need to put systems that work very well to achieve your goals. You need to, put a hiring process that looks at merits as opposed to ethnicity or tribe or friends. But what happened in South Sudan right after independence was they were just rewarding the freedom fighters, regardless of merit.
Doesn't all that take a lot of time? I mean, even the United States didn't have all those institutions right at independence.
Of course, it's not done in a day, but every process starts with a step. There was no step taken.
Who do you blame for that?
The leadership of the country. I blame the leadership of the country. I mean, it's not an individual, but collectively. The South Sudanese people told the international community that they want to be a free country. And so those who were at the helm of leadership did not do their homework very well.
Because they saw it as a way to get wealthy.
Of course, money
was
thrown onto their face. The oil revenue was thrown onto their faces, and there was no accountability. There were no institutions of good governance, and so the press was muzzled. Nobody was backing at them, and so they did it as they see fit.
So you know, there are also inherited legacies of colonialism, of underdevelopment, and the shortcomings that the SPLM inherited build on those legacies. The center-periphery dynamics here, and instead of, like John said, putting in place the institutions to check individuals and their actions in government, that did not happen. So what happened was the SPLM state continued perpetuating the legacies inherited from the Sudanese state that built on legacies from colonialism, which is like the center becomes everything. A small group of elite hijacking government really basically for their own personal benefit.
But you know, Brian, all we in America really hear about Africa is about war and famine and corruption. Convince me that there's more to Africa than that.
Well, there's more to that. I mean, there's great talent. There is good people. There are good things happening.
But can you see how frustrated?
Yes, it is. Even within South Sudan, where you see this gloomy picture, when you go to government, like we know that government is actually ineffective largely, but there are individuals in government that are really motivated, that are working hard, doing their best under those very, very difficult conditions to make things possible for the general population. And I get a lot of pride and satisfaction watching these selfless individuals do their work, and that's why it's important not to forget about South Sudan entirely, but to work really hard to ensure that the next system that comes in place puts in place institutions that are really credible, that are strong and effective.
And you think that's possible?
It is possible.
It's very frustrating to see Sudan, especially all the things that South Sudan has gone through, the people of South Sudan have gone through, and the famines and the killings and all that, and then now they're killing each other again.
I know. I mean, that's really, really very frustrating.
Tragic.
And I think the leaders of South Sudan ought to look themselves in the mirror and say to themselves, look what we have created, you know. I mean, it's despicable, it's really shameful. And if you are a leader in South Sudan and you've been in power for all this time and your people can't have any access to water, despite the fact that you inherited immense financial resources because of the oil resource, you should really be ashamed of yourself, and you should really think about alternative leadership for that country.
But again, this is just cycle of violence that's not managed properly, because the leaders left the violence to complete its cycle. They ought to have stopped it. They ought to have come out. For instance, in December 2013, President Kiir and Riek Machar ought to have come out in public and make a very strong statement to assure the nation that there was no coup, that this is a political disagreement, that they are still together. But in the absence of that, there are interest groups that took advantage and polarized the situation, and that's why we are where we are now. Coming to your question about if there's anything good in South Sudan, there is anything good. There is something good in South Sudan. The South Sudanese people, regardless of the suffering they are going through, they are still strong and they can afford to smile and stand tall. Because if you look at what is happening in South Sudan, of course there are people running to the neighboring countries, but there are still people who are inside their voices, who are speaking out against what is happening in the country.
So John, how long does this conflict go on for? Or is South Sudan going to be in a constant state of conflict?
I believe that this conflict can only end if the root causes are addressed, because this is a conflict that is embedded in the fabric of the society. Look at it from this perspective. The two leaders, the two communities have been living together, but there are certain activities that make them don't cross their path. This This is one. And then secondly, poverty in South Sudan is at a very, very immense level. And so there's a struggle for resources. If you provide resources for everybody, if you make people, if you empower them, then they will see no point of carrying a gun and running around in the bush. The reason why people are fighting right now, because they see it as a means of getting employment. They see, if I join the rebellion after peace, I'll be appointed a minister, I'll be appointed a commander, I'll get a job. But if you give them an alternative means of survival, they will not look for conflict. Nobody likes to die. Nobody likes to die, regardless of where you are.
Just to build on that point, the government inherited a lot of money, but it, you know, so it began perpetuating the center-periphery dynamics here, where the center has everything and didn't share the wealth. And so everybody, the only way that people, the government could consolidate its position was through jobs, you know, creating more states, and the government is the largest employer. And that's the only way that citizens can get resources from the government. Get a job with the government. If you can't get a job with the government, you're not going to get a road or a hospital. So the government has to move away from that perspective, develop other industries, infrastructure, other alternative revenue generating.
Let's hope that they do this so that the suffering can finally end. Brian and John, thanks so much for being on the program.
My pleasure.
This has been the Mimi Geerges Show. You can see all of our programs on WHUT.org and YouTube. Connect with us on Facebook and Twitter and leave me your comments there. I look forward to hearing your thoughts. Thanks for watching, and I hope you'll join me again next time.